For decades, Arizona has been a promise, a dream carved out of dust and sunlight, a place where the impossible became possible. They came from everywhere: California, Illinois, New York. Families, investors, visionaries, all chasing the same illusion of endless growth under an endless sky. Phoenix rose from the desert like a modern miracle, a city without rivers, fed by pipelines and promises. Suburbs spread like wildfire, houses multiplying faster than the cacti they replaced. Every street, every pool, every green lawn declared victory over nature. And for a time, it worked. The desert was conquered, but mirages don't last forever. Beneath the shimmering heat, something fragile was breaking. The one thing the desert never truly offered, water, was running out. For decades, the Colorado River gave life to this illusion. A vast artery flowing from the Rocky Mountains, feeding farms, cities, and dreams across 7 states. But as temperatures rose and drought deepened, the river began to shrink. Reservoirs like Lake Mead and Lake Powell fell to historic lows, exposing the white scars of a system pushed beyond its limits. Arizona kept growing anyway. Developers built faster, politicians promised more, and people kept coming. 1 million new residents in just a few years, even as the water levels kept dropping. It was a paradox, a state expanding into emptiness, thriving on a resource that no longer existed. Drive through Phoenix today and you'll see it. Endless subdivisions stretching into the horizon, each one with lawns that should not exist, each one demanding water that can no longer be spared. The desert isn't just hot, it's thirsty. And the wells that once gave freely now whisper warnings. But the illusion remains powerful. The houses sell, the prices rise. Investors call it growth. Locals call it survival. Yet beneath it all, the numbers don't lie. Groundwater is vanishing faster than it can be replaced. Entire aquifers, built up over thousands of years, are being drained in decades. In some parts of the state, the land is literally sinking. Farm fields near Casa Grande have dropped several feet, the ground collapsing where water once filled the empty spaces below. Satellite images show it clearly. Scars on the land, signs of a thirst that can no longer be hidden. And still, the dream continues, because to stop now would mean admitting the truth, that the entire foundation of Arizona's growth was built on borrowed time. Politicians talk about desalination plants, pipelines from the Gulf of California, water-sharing agreements that never come. But the math doesn't change. There's not enough water for the life that Arizona has built. And yet, construction cranes still pierce the horizon like monuments to denial. At night, the city glows like a constellation. Phoenix, Tucson, Mesa, shining defiantly against the black desert. But from above, it looks fragile, like a spark in a sea of darkness, held together by faith more than fact. Because deep down, everyone knows. You can't grow forever in a place that was never meant to sustain growth. You can't fight the desert forever and expect to win. The settlers who first came here called it the Valley of the Sun, a paradise of light, opportunity, and second chances. But they forgot something essential. The sun doesn't nurture here. It burns. And everything it touches eventually turns to dust. So the question now isn't whether Arizona will run out of water. It's when. And when it does, what happens to the millions who believed in the mirage? The desert doesn't forgive. It only waits, silent, patient, eternal. And as the pipelines dry and the wells collapse, the mirage begins to fade. What's left behind is the truth, that no empire, no city, no dream can outlast the limits of nature. Arizona grew faster than almost any place in America. But what if its greatest strength, its growth, was also its curse? Somewhere beyond the city lights, the desert breathes. It has seen this before. Civilizations rising and falling on promises of control. It knows how this story ends, and as the night wind moves across the sand, carrying the faint smell of dust and heat, you can almost hear it whisper, "You built too much, too fast, on land that was never yours to tame." The crisis began quietly, not with floods or chaos, but with silence. Reservoirs that once shimmered like mirrors of the sky began to recede. The boat ramps at Lake Mead stretched farther and farther into the dust, leading to nothing but cracked earth. A bathtub ring of bleached rock marked the years of decline, a scar visible from space. At first, people ignored it. The lawn stayed green, the golf courses watered, the fountains danced under the desert sun. Arizona had faced droughts before. The desert was resilient, they said. But this time, it was different. The Colorado River, the lifeline of the Southwest, was dying. 7 states depended on it, each one drawing from a river that was no longer whole. And as its flow dwindled, an old truth resurfaced. When water becomes scarce, cooperation dries up first. The first signs of war were political. In Washington, committees met in air-conditioned rooms, speaking in careful tones about allocations and shortages. But beneath the jargon was fear. Nevada accused Arizona. Arizona blamed California. Farmers pointed fingers at cities. Cities pointed back at the farms. And all the while, the river kept shrinking. In Pinal County, farmers watched their irrigation canals go dry for the first time in living memory. Fields that once glowed green turned brown and brittle. The ground cracked open, and the dust returned, ancient dust, silent and unforgiving. Some farmers sold their land. Others drilled deeper, chasing water that no longer existed. Every drop pulled from the earth made the next one harder to find. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, the skyline grew higher. Developers kept building, because stopping meant admitting defeat. Entire communities were approved even as officials quietly warned that groundwater would not sustain them. In some regions, the state halted new permits altogether, a rare moment of truth in a sea of denial. But the demand didn't stop. Investors turned to private wells, water imports, and even speculative rights, trading liquid gold like stocks on the market. Water became not just a resource, but a currency. And those without it were left behind. In the city, the rich adapted. Luxury homes installed private wells and imported landscaping that mimicked the desert aesthetic, fake nature for a dying one. In poorer neighborhoods, it was different. Communities faced rising bills, water pressure cuts, and the creeping fear of scarcity. Some began to wonder, would the cities of the future divide not by class or race, but by who has water and who doesn't? The politics grew darker. Arizona, once united by its frontier spirit, began to fracture. Rural counties demanded independence from what they called urban overreach. Activists accused real estate developers of corruption, and a quiet exodus began. Families leaving not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't afford to stay. In Tucson, researchers mapped the aquifers, revealing the invisible collapse beneath their feet. They saw the ground literally sinking, subsidence zones spreading like bruises under the surface. The land was giving up, folding inward where the water once supported it. But perhaps the most haunting truth came from the river itself. The Colorado no longer reached the sea. Where it once met the Gulf of California, there was only dust, a dry delta that stood as a monument to human overreach. A river that fed 40 million lives, now reduced to a trickle before it died. And yet, the politics raged on. Arizona demanded more water. California refused to give up its share. The federal government threatened to intervene, but did little. Because how do you ration something that's already gone? This is the new face of conflict. Not fought with weapons, but with contracts, pipelines, and desperation. It's a war waged in boardrooms and farmlands, in desert towns where people count gallons like soldiers count bullets. As the crisis deepened, strange alliances formed. Some farmers turned to solar fields, replacing crops with panels that fed power instead of people. Others left their land behind, their homes swallowed by dust storms that rolled in from the empty fields. The desert was reclaiming what was always its own. But amid the chaos, there were voices still clinging to hope. Scientists, engineers, and dreamers talked of desalination, cloud seeding, wastewater recycling, miracles of technology to replace miracles of rain. Yet every plan shared the same flaw. They all needed time. And time is what Arizona no longer has. Because beneath every political debate, beneath every new construction site, there's a truth that no one dares to say aloud. The war for water isn't coming. It's already here. And it's not just Arizona's fight. It is a preview of what's coming for the world, a warning carved into sand and stone. When the rivers dry and the wells collapse, we'll discover what civilization is really built on. Not concrete, not steel, not power, but water. And once that's gone, everything else will follow. The Mirage is fading now. You can see it in the cracked soil, in the quiet fields, in the ghost neighborhoods at the desert's edge. The growth was never real. The war was inevitable. And in the silence that follows, the desert waits, as it always has, for the next civilization to forget. It began with promises, the same promises that built every empire before it. The promise of land, of home ownership, of endless growth in the desert sun. For decades, Arizona was sold as a vision of freedom. Wide streets, big houses, cheap living. A dream painted in stucco and sandstone. But that dream, like the mirage that shimmered above the desert highway, was never meant to last. Even as the rivers ran dry, the cranes kept moving. Developers poured concrete into a landscape that was running out of water. Investors saw opportunity, not risk, because growth was profitable and denial was easy. Between 2015 and 2023, Phoenix became one of the fastest-growing cities in America. Thousands arrived every month, families escaping California prices, investors chasing quick returns, retirees chasing the sun. Entire suburbs rose overnight, cul-de-sacs blooming like geometric flowers on satellite maps. But the foundations were already cracking. The first warning came in whispers: mortgage defaults in new developments, homes that wouldn't sell, and neighborhoods without enough water rights to connect to the city grid. Still, construction continued, because stopping meant admitting that the dream had turned into debt. And so the cycle repeated, speculation built on speculation, each layer balancing on the illusion of endless growth. Home prices soared beyond reason. Investors flipped properties before they were even finished. Artificial lakes and golf courses reappeared, symbols of luxury in a place that could no longer afford the illusion. Then came the drought maps, deep red zones spreading like infection across the Southwest. Insurance companies began to back out, calling the risk unquantifiable. Suddenly, the future was too expensive to insure. Yet in the heart of Phoenix, billboards still promised affordable paradise. Developers launched new phases, boasting sustainable designs that were anything but. Smart homes, eco-lawns, and green branding couldn't hide the truth. The land beneath them was running dry. By 2028, cracks began to appear, literal and economic. Houses built on sinking ground developed fractures across their walls. Foundations shifted as the aquifers below collapsed. Entire neighborhoods leaned. Not enough to fall, just enough to remind residents that something was wrong. Real estate videos vanished from YouTube. Agents stopped posting poolside tours, and a new kind of content emerged: drone footage of half-finished subdivisions, empty streets, and for sale signs fading in the heat. Arizona's boomtown image began to crumble under the weight of its own marketing. Then the exodus began. Not dramatic, not overnight, but steady, silent. Families who once saw Arizona as the land of opportunity now packed up their dreams and left behind unsold homes. Rising utility costs, water restrictions, insurance hikes, and mortgage stress all collided into a slow-motion collapse. The investors noticed first, the ones who had turned neighborhoods into portfolios. They started to sell quietly before the panic reached the headlines. Some even walked away, entire blocks of foreclosed properties left to decay in the sun. The silence grew louder. Desert winds howled through empty homes, rattling the blinds of houses that had never been lived in. Developments once filled with promise now echoed with nothing but dust and the soft creak of settling walls. The mirage of prosperity was breaking apart, and yet the data told the truth long before the news did. Vacancy rates spiked, construction halted, and for the first time in decades, Phoenix's population stopped growing. Some economists called it a correction, but locals knew it was something deeper, a reckoning. Because this wasn't just a housing market crash. It was the unraveling of a belief that you could defy nature, build endlessly, and somehow never pay the price. The same water that built Arizona's empire was gone, and without it, the entire system, from mortgages to malls, began to dry up with it. At night, the skyline still shimmered, its lights glowing against the black desert horizon. But beneath that glow, more windows were dark than before. Each one a story of departure, each one a chapter in the quiet fall of a city that thought it could outgrow the desert. Now even the air feels heavier, as if the heat itself remembers what was lost. Developers speak in softer tones. Local news avoids the word collapse, replacing it with adjustment, but the truth is no longer hidden. Arizona's real estate boom was never about homes. It was about faith in infinite growth. And when that faith ran out, the empire of stucco began to crumble. Because in the end, you can't sell what the desert doesn't give, and no amount of optimism can refill a dry riverbed. The reckoning didn't arrive with thunder. It came in whispers, in the soft hum of air conditioners that no longer worked, in the silence of neighborhoods where children's voices had vanished. The sun rose the same way it always had, but now it felt heavier, like an omen hanging in the sky. By the early 2030s, Arizona had changed. The dream that once drew millions was fading like a mirage. Empty subdivisions stretched across the horizon, ghost grids of asphalt and streetlights leading to nowhere. Satellite images told the story better than words. Rows of identical rooftops baking under a sun that showed no mercy, surrounded by the same endless sand they were meant to conquer. The water restrictions had become permanent. Lakes shrank into memories. Even the mighty Colorado was little more than a scar through the desert. Cities that once advertised limitless growth now rationed their most basic need, a few gallons per person per day. Some adapted. People tore out lawns, filled pools with gravel, and learned to live with less. Others left entirely, their homes abandoned to the wind. Entire communities migrated north, chasing water the same way settlers once chased gold. It wasn't called a refugee crisis, not yet. But that's what it was. The media covered it in bursts. Stories of the Sunbelt exodus, drone footage of cracked reservoirs, families loading their lives into moving vans. But the cameras never stayed long. Disaster had become too common to shock anyone, and the rest of the country looked away. Phoenix, once the symbol of progress, was now the front line of a new kind of collapse. Not a sudden disaster, but a slow unraveling. A heat wave here, a blackout there, a new tax to cover the cost of water imports. The cracks spread like veins beneath the surface, invisible until they weren't. The rich stayed longer than most. They could afford private wells, air-cooled estates, and trucked in water from states still willing to sell. But even they began to sense it. The unease, the fragility. Helicopters no longer symbolized success. They were escape plans. In the outskirts, where new developments once promised paradise, the desert was winning back its territory. Sand-buried sidewalks, tumbleweeds filled driveways. Coyotes roamed where children once played. At night, the empty homes stood like tombstones, monuments to denial. And still, politicians promised recovery. They spoke of desalination plants, pipeline projects, and new resilience strategies. But those plans lived on paper, not in reality. There was no money, no time, and no will left to rebuild what was already gone. The reckoning wasn't just physical, it was psychological. For generations, Arizona had represented the American ideal: independence, expansion, optimism. Now that optimism had turned into a kind of madness, a refusal to see the truth. That progress without limits is just self-destruction disguised as ambition. The scientists warned it years ago. They said the desert remembers. It never forgets what it's owed, and now it was collecting its debt. Rivers dried, wells collapsed, but something deeper broke: trust. People no longer believed in the future of their own cities. The real estate signs turned to rust, the promises faded from the billboards, and silence settled over what used to be the fastest-growing region in America. In a small town outside Tucson, a journalist filmed what would become one of the last viral images of the collapse: a single row of houses standing in the desert, half buried in sand. In the background, the sun set in blood-orange light. the air thick with dust. The caption read simply, "The dream is over." It wasn't the end of Arizona. People would remain. They always do. But it was the end of the story they told themselves, the story that said they could defy nature forever. The reckoning left behind a strange beauty. At night, under the desert stars, the ruins of subdivisions glowed faintly in the moonlight, geometric ghosts against an infinite landscape. Silence, vast and eternal, replaced the noise of construction. For the first time in a century, the desert was quiet again. And in that quiet, there was something almost sacred. A reminder that nature doesn't collapse. Only our illusions do. When future historians look back on this age, they won't see it as a sudden fall, but as a slow fade, a civilization that built itself on borrowed water and borrowed time. The final lesson of Arizona is not about scarcity or drought. It's about memory. The land remembers what we forget, that everything has a cost, and the bill always comes due. As the credits of civilization roll across the horizon, the desert waits, patient, silent, watching the mirage dissolve into dust.